ecosystem. So first, I think the main thing is you've got to understand the key definitions, because they love asking definitions of what is an ecosystem, what is a niche, what is a community, what is a habitat. So you need to be aware of it. So an ecosystem, basically all living species live in an ecosystem. Like I said here, it's very straightforward. So like, and the definition of it is an interaction of a community of living organisms with non-living organisms. And that's all it is: interaction of a community of living organisms with non-living organisms. So yeah, because it involves not just the things that are living, but also the non-living parts as well, and the way they all interact in their environment. That's the key thing. Yeah, so just remember that definition. So interaction of a community of living organisms with non-living parts of their environment. So with ecosystem, it's about the living and the non-living, because you've got everything in an ecosystem. For example, I have a fish tank downstairs. That's an example of an ecosystem. You've got fish in there which are living. You've got plants. You've got stones and rocks and other stuff, and water surrounding them, and algae kind of growing in there. Bacteria lives in the water. It's a whole ecosystem, and I think that's quite remarkable, really. Just like we live in an ecosystem as well. A human body is an ecosystem. Again, you've got all sorts of living things going on in there. Rainforest is another example, deserts. So yeah, just remember ecosystems, an interaction of a community of living organisms with non-living parts of their environment. And that key word, I think, is interaction. I know it's not highlighted here, but it's all about the interaction of living and non-living. So biotic and non-biotic factors. Communities. So communities are all the living organisms in an ecosystem. I'm just checking it with my definitions. Yeah. So are all living organisms in an ecosystem. Sometimes you can classify as all populations. That's what I've written in my definition. So you can say all populations of living organisms in an ecosystem, in a certain area at a certain time. So that's what population is. So this is a this is a community. This is a community. So if you have a population of and then populations and all the individuals of one species in an ecosystem. So them three kind of go hand in hand. So if you think of a population, say these are sardines. Population is all the individuals of sardines in the ecosystem. The community will involve that population of sardines plus all the other living organisms as well, whether that includes other fish, like you can see here, whether that includes, I don't know, cod and some tadpoles and frogs, and obviously seaweed and plants, so everything that's living. And then an ecosystem is that interaction of all the living and all the non-living parts of the population at a certain time. That interaction between the living and non-living animals and parts of a population, like it says here. Yep, in the environment, that's the word. Is the community interaction of the community of living organisms and non-living organisms. So think of it like that, stepwise. Population is individuals of community is all the living organisms in an ecosystem. So you need to say that word again, all. A key word to say is all the populations. That's what I would say in the exam if it asked you a definition, because population comes first and then community will include all the populations of living organisms. So all the populations of living organisms in an ecosystem. And then like we said, ecosystem is the interaction of the living and non-living parts of a community at a certain area at a certain time. Simple as that. Remember those three definitions. Practice writing them down, know them off by heart. When it comes up, easy, reel it off. Cool, more definitions. So producers or autotrophs. So a producer or an autotroph uses light or chemical energy to make food, either by photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. Plants, algae, and bacteria, including this. So producers, you guys probably have heard this term before. Food producers is a very common term. Think about it when it comes to food chains. A food chain will always start with a producer. So a leaf or a plant or something that will be able to produce its own food and kickstart a food chain. Because obviously plants carry out photosynthesis, so they use light. Things like algae and bacteria are also useful. I mean, algae is a type of plant, so they use photosynthesis. Bacteria sometimes can use what we call chemosynthesis, where they use kind of chemical energy to make food. So that's another example of an autotroph. And the way autotroph works is auto means kind of automatic, like auto yourself. So it basically defines as something that makes their own food. So autotrophs make their own food, basically. Not getting it from others. So that's a producer. Yeah, but just remember it could be light or chemical energy. I know a lot of people just think it's light, but it can also be chemical energy as well. So make sure you remember both of them. I think that's fairly straightforward. And then the opposite is a heterotroph or a consumer. So we go up in primary, secondary, tertiary consumers, or quaternary, even if it goes that far. And they rely on other organisms for energy by either eating or decomposing them. So it can be herbivores, can be carnivores, can be decomposers. So if you've got grass and cows eat the grass, then yeah, that's a herbivore, but it's a consumer or a heterotroph because the cow is relying on the grass for its nutrition and energy. Just like with things that then will eat the cows, I don't know, like a lion in Africa. Say we're in Africa and we've got cattle around eating grass, and then lions come and eat the cattle. They rely on the cow for their energy. So the consumers or heterotrophs, hetero always means different. So relying on a different organism for its energy, not on itself, like an autotroph. That's that. Again, don't need to have any issues with that. And then energy in ecosystems. So all organisms need energy to live, and this energy obviously comes from the sun. Plants and algae photosynthesize the sunlight to form carbohydrates. Other organisms then eat the plants. So in an ecosystem, energy is basically passed along a food chain, like you guys are aware. So ecosystem was obviously living and all non-living organisms in an environment interacting together. And the energy starts from the sun with photosynthesis, usually with plants and algae, and then they get passed along through the food chain, through the energy. Things eat the plants, things then eat those animals, and then those animals get eaten, etc. So yeah, and all kind of underwater food chains start with algae usually, because small fish eat algae, and then bigger fish eat the small fish, and then you might get like a seal which eats big fish, and then like a shark will eat the big seal. So all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's how energy is passed along in ecosystems through food chains. So here we go. Here's an example of a food chain. So the sun always starts it off. You don't usually write the sun in a food chain, but here is just showing you an example. You normally just start with the producer. So pondweed in this case, it obviously always has to be a plant. So pondweed photosynthesize, tadpoles eat the weed, little fish eat the tadpoles, and then big fish will eat those little fish. And that's what happens. And energy will get passed along through that, all starting with the sun and the photosynthesis that's happened, that's created energy in the plant. So, and then next definitions. We've been over community, we've been over population, we've been over ecosystem. Another one is the niche. Niche, really, when I think niche, I would think role. Role is the really key word when you talk about niche. So niche is a place and a role in the ecosystem that an organism lives. So what someone came up, I don't know this theory, but basically every organism has a role in their ecosystem. They all play a part. For an ecosystem to work, every living organism carries out a certain role. I know it sounds weird, but like, and for example, here it's talking about a wolf's niche being in the tundra where they hunt deer in packs. But the wolves are needed to do that, because if the wolves don't do that, then there's too much deer, and then whatever the deer eat, there might be too much of that, and it's not sustaining. So all ecosystems sustain themselves, and there's kind of a hierarchy of balance, if you kind of get what I'm saying with that. So that's what this is kind of on about with the niche, the fact that every organism has a role and a place in that ecosystem that they live. Yeah, they're deserving to live there, and you know, they're needed in that ecosystem. The way the ecosystem sustains itself, that is, they're part of that role. I don't know if any of you guys are interested in sharks, but I'm always reading about sharks. So I have an interest in that. And they're always talking about the fact that shark numbers are going down. They're being hunted a lot. They're having to move around, and the fact that it's not good for the water ecosystem, because sharks obviously at the top of the food chain restore balance, because they probably eat animals below them, and then if they're not being eaten, they increase, and then they will then kind of, it affects the whole balance of an ecosystem, basically, is what I'm trying to say. But that's what a niche is. So when you think of niche, I want you to think of a place or a role of a species within its environment. Yeah, and that helps to maintain the population. So yeah, so a place and a role, they're the two keywords. I remember in mark schemes, it's always, whenever it sees the word role, it kind of just gives you the mark. So don't forget that word. Put both of them, a place and a role in the ecosystem that an organism lives. And all organisms have a niche. Yep, we talked about ecosystems before, but some other key things to remember: that every living organism in an ecosystem is interdependent. They have adaptations to that ecosystem, so they survive. Polar bear is adaptations to the ecosystem in the Arctic. It's not going to survive in the desert like a camel would, and they're able to compete, survive, and reproduce. It's basic, simple stuff. Interdependence. So again, another key word I would know and be able to reel off. So that's basically the complex and fragile relationship between all organisms and their environments. So again, I mentioned this before, but the relationship between an organism and its environment is it's quite complex, and it's very fragile, because a little disruption in one certain thing can affect the whole balance of the environment. So if you break down the word, is like inter is between, dependence obviously being dependent on something. So it's like kind of that dependence between different species, how they're all kind of interlinked and they all rely on each other for that. So yeah, that's what interdependence means. So again, I would remember that definition. And this is a good example of why, when we destroy the rainforests, so obviously I'm sure you guys are aware, we're destroying rainforests, they're kind of deteriorating at a rapid rate, and rainforests are home to so many habitats, so many ecosystems and environments. And the fact that we just take down trees it is a much wider effect than just taking down trees. You know, it kills a lot more species than just the trees. There's so many things that live inside the rainforest, so many different species, and you just destroy ecosystems as well, and kind of affect that balance and that interdependence between all the organisms within that. So it has a much widespread effect. So that's interdependence. Remember that. Key things that organisms rely on food for: so nutrients, food, water, shelter, pollination, seed spore. So they're more plants, but things like basic stuff, food, water, nutrients, I'm sure you guys are aware. I don't need to reiterate that. Cool. And then this is important to know. So abiotic versus biotic. So abiotic factors are non-living parts of an ecosystem, whereas biotic factors are living parts. So again, you need to be able to remember a few of these and understand why they're important. So abiotic factors are all non-living parts of an ecosystem. So light intensity. So I'm sure you guys are aware, light obviously is needed in photosynthesis. So it's very important in an ecosystem, because obviously if you've not got the right amount of light, plants can't photosynthesize, and then it affects the ecosystem, because those plants aren't able to grow. But light is very, very important. Temperature, obviously all our enzymes in our body rely on temperature, and temperatures also affects things like water and other stuff, so that's very important. Water availability, like I mentioned, obviously animals need water to survive, some more than others. Soil pH and mineral content. Some animals rely on soil, pH, minerals. I'm not just talking about animals, I'm talking about us as well, to be fair, humans. So we need that to be, obviously, if as humans we grow crops and plants, and if the soil pH and minerals aren't there, then plants aren't going to be able to grow nice and big, particularly crops and things like that, which obviously we rely on. Winds, so things like seed dispersal relies on winds to be kind of disperse those around the place. That's important. Oxygen, CO2. So again, we rely on oxygen. Plants and other stuff rely on CO2. That's important. And then rock type, soil depth is another one. So yeah, these are non-living parts. They're quite straightforward to think of. I would definitely remember at least these first few: light, temperature, water, winds, soil pH. They're often very, very common and come up in exams, so make sure you're aware of them. So yeah, these are kind of breaking it down. Sunlight is energy photosynthesis, and then light intensity differs between ecosystems. So I remember a good example is a rainforest, because again, you get different types of trees. You get ones right at the bottom where the rainforest is really dark because obviously all the light's blocked out. And then you get ones at the top which grow really nice and big and require a lot more light because that's where all the light is going to be collected from. Yeah, and in shady conditions, plants are more adapted. So you see large leaves to collect the limited amount of sunlight they get. And yeah, that everything's adapted to where it is and how much sunlight it's going to get. Temperature is obviously photosynthesis as well. Plants can only photosynthesize between certain temperatures, and then mammals and birds need certain temperatures for survival. Like I mentioned, it's all to do with enzymes. Enzymes function at certain temperatures. If it's too low, they can't function. Your body systems are too slow, and if it's too high, the enzymes will denature, like you guys are aware of. And then water is another one. So water, again, remember things in the desert are very adapted to having low water. So things like cacti and xerophytes, they're very good at conserving water and being able to hold that limited amount of water. And yeah, remember water is just generally needed for life. And then obviously soil for nitrates. That's for growing, mainly for plants, particularly. Winds, yep. Remember, plants also lose water by transpiration, which is when water kind of gets blown off their surface. So kind of evaporation of water from plants in particular, and winds can affect that. Oxygen, we mentioned, we need oxygen. Yep, fish need a high level of oxygen. Again, in my fish tank, I have an air pump which kind of blows bubbles into the water, and that produces lots of oxygen for my fish. Otherwise, they might die. Carbon dioxide, photosynthesis, and then rock type. So be aware of abiotic factors. They can come up in questions. They can ask you, they might give you an ecosystem or environment and say, list the important abiotic factors of this ecosystem. You need to be able to list them off. So definitely know a good few examples of that. Living. So living ones, again, a bit less specialized. So less commonly asked for, I'd say, but obviously important to remember. So biotics are kind of all the living organisms in the ecosystem. So all the living factors, and that's important to remember. So abiotic, we talked about non-living factors, and biotic is the living factors. So living features of an ecosystem. So food availability is one. So how much food is there? That's very important. That's what's needed because food is there. So certain animals eat plants. How much plants are there? Is there enough for all the species? Like we eat apples. Is there enough apples growing on the trees for us to eat? Pathogens and parasites. So that's important. Obviously, pathogens and parasites which can cause disease. They can make things ill. They can wipe out populations and wipe out species. So that's important to be aware of. Predators. Predation is a massive living factor in an ecosystem. So obviously, predation would affect everything because if there's too many predators, then a species might kind of deteriorate and decrease. But if there's not that many, they might increase, and in turn that affects the prey below them. So that's one. And then another one is competition. So competition is kind of stratified into two things. So you've got interspecific competition and you've got intraspecific. So interspecific being different species, whereas intraspecific is individuals of the same species. So here's showing interspecific between two different ones. So if you've got a rabbit and a mouse, they're similar levels on the food chain, they eat similar things. So they have competition between them for food and other resources and habitats and all that. So that's another thing. So when you think biotic, it says what it does on the tin, but living features of an ecosystem: food, disease and parasites, pathogens, predators, competition, all that is one. Pathogens and stuff is obviously important in disease. Remember that. And all this kind of stuff is important. Even things like territory, like forming habitats and territories. Mating is another one. Often, animals fight over a mate, and the losing animal might die or get really badly injured. That's another one. There's so many. But again, have that in your head. Yep, so we talked about that, about species decreasing without food. And yeah, we discussed that. Good. And then, yeah, competition is a good one. So species in ecosystem, because a good example is red and grey squirrels. Because back in the day, we used to have a lot of red squirrels. We don't really see them anymore because when the grey squirrels came along, they were bigger, they were stronger, they were faster, and really they just completely wiped out the red squirrels because they were able to form habitats better, get the food better, and in the end, red squirrels have just kind of died out. I think you see a few in Scotland still, but here in the UK, in England, you don't really. I mean, you won't see any at all. You'll just see lots of grey squirrels everywhere. But that's a good example of how interspecific competition can affect different species when one species isn't able to compete with the other. Good. So let's talk about competition quickly. So I mentioned it briefly. So obviously, organisms compete with each other for abiotic and biotic resources. So temperature, light, all that, as well as competition, food, predators, they're all competed for in a population, in an ecosystem. So the two types are intraspecific. So intraspecific is between organisms in the same species. So again, things like food, territory, sunlight, nutrients, and mating. So a good example of that is like here it says here, 2 male robins sing to attract 1 female. So often species of the same one will always kind of fight over a mate. And if you guys have seen some brutal fights, so like I remember seeing one of 2 hippos fighting, and that was brutal, proper fight. I saw a giraffe one once as well. If you want to go on YouTube and watch them, it's quite interesting. But yeah, that's important to remember that can happen as well. So yeah, so that's intraspecific. They've got to be the same species. They've got to be a robin. They've got to be 2 hippos. They've got to be 2 giraffes. They've got to be 2 cods or whatever. Like it's got to be the same species. But that's what intraspecific. Intra being within, so within the same species. And then, yep, and like I mentioned before, grey and red squirrels. So this is interspecific. So remember, interspecific is different species. So same concept, but it's to do with different species. Inter being different. And again, for the same things: food, territory, sunlight if they're plants or animals that rely on sunlight, nutrients, other stuff. So grey and red squirrel is a good example of that. And yeah, that's a good example of how interspecific competition can really affect a species quite badly and completely wipe it out. It's a good read if you want to look into that. Symbiosis. So symbiotic relationships are where 2 species live closely together. So that's important to remember. So 2 species that live closely together are known as a symbiotic relationship. And mutualism is where both species benefit. So I'm going to go over the terms related to symbiotic. So when you think of symbiotic, just think 2 species that live closely together. And then mutualism is where both species benefit each other. So for example, insects and flowers. So particularly bees. So if you think of bees and like those nice bright pink, yellow flowers or whatever, they all benefit from each other. A bee will go inside a flower, collect the nectar, which is what it wants, but at the same time, it will obviously scrape some of that pollen and then it'll go and pollinate another flower. And so the flower is benefiting and the bee is benefiting. Oxen and oxpeckers, they have a mutualism effect. Cleaner fish is a good one. I like that one. If you've seen those cleaner fish, they sit on sharks and kind of turtles and other large fish, and they clean the surface of bacteria on the shark's skin surface, and in turn they'll just get a free ride. The shark will travel and the cleaner fish could just sit there and get a free ride to wherever it's going next. So that's, again, mutualism. So remember that. Conversely, the next one is commensalism. So there's 3 terms you need to remember. So commensalism is where one species benefits and the other one is neither harmed nor helped. So it's like one benefits and the other's like, oh, it doesn't really matter. Nothing happens to that. So barnacles on whales. So obviously that would benefit the barnacles, because if they have a benefit that certain whale if they have a barnacle, but it won't affect any other species because whales don't really fight with each other and this and that. Like, it's not going to affect anything else. So it's not going to affect the other whales. Birds building nests in trees. So again, it benefits the birds because they have a safe space to create a nest and create new offspring, but it's not going to benefit the tree in any way having a nest on it. That's a good example. That's commensalism. So we've got mutualism, where both benefit, commensalism, where one benefits and the others just nothing happens. And then parasitism is where one benefits and the other is kind of disadvantaged and is harmed. So things like fleas, ticks, lice, obviously they're not good. When they bite you, they're loving it because they get whatever they want. They get blood or this and that, but it's obviously bad for you because you feel ill and you could get disease. Plasmodium, like malaria. So again, the way mosquitoes do that. And then, yeah, then a couple of other examples which I'm not really sure about. But yeah, just be aware of those three terms. Symbiotic, two species living closely together. Oops. It's completely off. And then within that, just remember the three terms. So mutualism, which is where both are benefited. Then you got commensalism, which is when one is benefited and the other's nothing. The other's not really affected at all. Doesn't happen. Doesn't matter. Not good, not bad. And then parasitism, which is where one is affected and the other is disadvantaged. So remember those three terms when it comes to symbiotic relationships. Cool. That's that so far. Just going to check if there's any questions. Nope. Just ask any questions if you guys are not sure. Adaptations. So again, I'm sure you guys are aware of adaptations. So organisms need to survive and reproduce, but through evolution and the way animals have survived through generations, they become adapted to their environments and have evolved features that let them survive and reproduce better. Again, basic stuff, but important to be aware of in your exams. So camels are very adapted to living in the desert, as opposed to polar bears who adapt to living in the Arctic and the ice cold and the snow. And that's just basic stuff. So it can be structural, it can be behavioral, it can be physiological. So it could be certain structures of them. So the leaf shape of a plant, that might be adapted for them to allow lots and lots of sunlight to be collected, so they can carry lots of photosynthesis. Or even things like, for example, elephants have massive ears, and that's because they can flap and act as a fan almost to help in the heat. Behavioral, so kind of growing towards light. So plants are adapted to grow towards light. That's called phototropism. I'm not sure if you guys have covered it, but if you do biology further, you will. So the way plants kind of grow towards the light, again, to collect more sunlight for photosynthesis. Venus flytraps are a brilliant mechanism. So our drawing's going to be awful, but they have those spikes, don't they? And then a fly will come in. And it will come in, and then the Venus flytrap will then shut it, and it'll release kind of different liquids and toxins to digest the fly and kill it. Physiological, poison and other chemical defenses. So again, plants are adapted to using stuff like that. Plants and animals more so. Like a good example of that is like the poison dart frog or whatever. That really small, brightly coloured frog, which is terribly poisonous. And it's like that colour almost disattracts other predators from eating it. Because if anything goes near it and tries it, it'll kind of just release poison on its surface, and that would be a massive form of defense against predators. So lots of different ways you can adaptations. Oh, this is just plants. Sorry, I'm talking about animals as well. But yeah, poisons can also be used in plants as well. Obviously, certain plants are very poisonous, as you're aware. So here's a good example of one. So a cactus is a plant that lives in hot conditions, desert, where there's not that much sunlight, and its adaptations reflect that, because everything in its adaptations is all to do with kind of conserving water, but also protecting against predators and all that stuff as well. So here's a good example of that. Again, this is a common exam question. They often give you things like cacti or other animals and say, list two adaptations or two features of a cactus that helps it protect against water loss or something like that. So important to be aware of them. So cactus have like a thick waxy skin, so that reduces the water loss, because obviously wax, water doesn't kind of, it basically almost traps the water, and it keeps the surface moist as well. So it conserves water and also reflects heat away. It's like a protective layer if you have kind of waxy skin. It has a massive water storing stem. So the stem of cactus is huge, and that's again purely to store lots and lots of water. The spikes protect it from animals, so animals that might want to come and eat the cacti. A spike was just going to deter that completely. Kind of thin spiky leaves to reduce water loss. So again, not a massive area for water to be on the outside and kind of dribble off or be evaporated. Deep roots, so roots that go even deeper than a usual plant would, and that's to extend even more into the soil and kind of branch out and collect as much water as possible. And also they're shallow as well, so they can collect the maximum amount of water, like I mentioned. But yeah, the roots are adapted, the stem is huge, the leaves are nice and thin to avoid water loss, the spikes are protection. So again, all basic stuff. So if you're never sure, just think of a cactus and what it looks like, and then go through it from there. But a cactus lives in a desert, a very hot environment, and that makes it kind of adapted to preventing water loss. Yep, so here's a good example of that. I believe these are Venus flytraps. So again, they have that trapping mechanism, leaves at the base, and you can see the spikes and stuff, so it prevents other predators going and eating them. And yeah, and that's the way they look with their flytrap teeth. Quite fascinating. A lot of my friends used to collect them and have them as pets. And well, I won't say they're a pet, but I have them in the house because it's obviously quite cool. But yeah, quite cool. Animals. So we talked about plants. I think in an exam, if they were to ask you about a plant, it'd be more like a xerophyte, so i.e. a plant that lives in hot conditions, because they're often the ones that have kind of very unique adaptations, very interesting ones. So animals as well, so it can be structural, so paw shape, so like polar bears have big flat paws, helps them kind of move through the snow at a good rate. They also have small ears to again reduce heat loss. Their thick furry skin, again to help conserve heat, keep them warm, because otherwise how are you going to survive in that massive snow and all that cold environment. Behavioral, so their mating dances of birds is a good example of that. So birds act in certain ways and mating. So I think what the bird it's going on about is I'm assuming kind of the males dance, and that attracts the females, and whoever dances the best will probably attract that. And then physiological, so poison, antifreeze blood, so blood that again is adapted to warm to cold conditions and that won't freeze, and poisons that kind of flow around in the blood as well. So that's all important with that. Again, adaptations is a hard one to teach. It's very self-explanatory. I think you guys have been doing it since year 7, year 6, so I wouldn't be too concerned about that. But again, one thing I was always taught with adaptations is always write an adjective. So like when you're talking about like the claws of a polar bear, always say sharp claws or large ears or something like that. But make sure you describe it. Don't just say paws for this. Make sure you say small, big, flat paws. That's a brilliant example. Large ears, thick fur, something like that. So always write an adjective in. But yeah, that's adaptations. Like I said, you're more likely to get asked about xerophytes, so like this kind of stuff. So remember the large stems, the spikes, the thick waxy skin, thin small leaves to reduce water loss, kind of deep roots, all that stuff. Yep, so here we go. Here's a good example. So I was talking about polar bears. Another example is a snowshoe hare. So yeah, similar to a polar bear, live in the Arctic. Their fur changes color, and that's again good to camouflage against predators. So that's another adaptation, the way their fur changes color. The fur is very thick, again, to survive in the Arctic. Large feet and short ears. Short ears is to reduce heat loss, and large feet help them move around in the snow. Whereas the polar opposite of that is the black-tailed jackrabbit, which lives in a desert, and they have brown fur, again, to blend in and camouflage with their environment. Their ears are very large, so to help heat loss. Their fur doesn't look as thick because obviously they live in a much warmer environment. So things like that. Penguins, so they have waterproof feathers, webbed feet, help them to swim, flipper-shaped wings. Their body is very streamlined, again, helps them to conserve heat, thick skin and fat, and heavy bones as well. So again, all of that helps them to survive in their respective environment. Giraffes have a long neck, tough tongues, fur, long legs, large heart, so all that stuff. Again, quite self-explanatory. With the long neck reaching food, their tongues, because they often eat kind of brambly, spiky food. So it helps them kind of cope with that and be able to rub against those kind of stuff. The fur, long legs as well. So fur is for like camouflage against predators, long legs, helping them to move quickly, run, and they have a massive, massive heart because they have a lot of blood to get around their body, obviously all the way up to their head, which is like for a massively long neck. So yeah. Cool. So there's that. It's basic stuff. Extremophiles is another one you need to be aware of. So extremophiles are ones that adapt to very extreme environments, such as like hydrothermal vents. So these are like things that kind of are really, really below the ocean surface. So if you go deep and deep and deep, you get these vents right at the bottom of the ocean when you go deep inside. And they're normally very hot, very cold, or acidic. And to live here, organisms need to be really extremely adapted. And they're called extreme. They have extremozymes. Extremozymes. But be aware of extremophiles, or extremophiles, being adapted to extreme environments. Again, it says it on the tin, extremophiles. So yeah, that's important to be aware of. So yeah, hydrothermal vents is one example. So energy doesn't originate from the sun. They get chemical energy in sulfur. So remember we talked about producers and autotrophs. It can be energy from the sun or it can just be chemical energy. Yeah, so just be aware of extremophiles. Again, I've seen this come up before as well. So just be aware of them. So really extreme environments, really extreme environments. Can't even speak today. Very hot, very cold, or acidic, and the extremozymes there that help them. They have certain enzymes that allow them. They're very rare, these things, and you're not going to be overly aware of them, but just be aware of them a little bit. So how do you measure organisms in a species? So I don't know if you guys have done this, but in year 11, we did this where we went out and we're counting plants on our school field, use what we call a quadrat. So a quadrat's a 0.25 meter squared square frame. And you sample randomly selected areas and kind of test the species in those. It's a good way of counting the number of species. So this is an example. So if a student is counting the number of daisies in a field, that is 1,000 meters squared big, the student makes a total of 10 quadrat readings. So what the student will do, because in case they ask you about the mechanism of that, so if you've got 1,000 meters square big field, they'll divide the field into little squares, and then they'll count them. So it might go from 1 to 1,000 if you do a meter squared squares. And then if you want to take 10 quadrat readings, which is a small sample, you need to randomly allocate that. So do a random sample and get 10 random numbers, and then they're the quadrats you're going to go to. So go into number 11, 15, etc. And then you go there, pop your quadrat down, and then count the number of daisies in that quadrat. So this is what happened. So here's the 10 readings, and then you work out an average, add them all up, divide them by the number of readings you took, which is 10. And then on average, there was 12.9 daisies per 0.25 meters squared. So sorry, this one did it per 0.25 meters squared. And obviously, the larger the sample, the more reliable it's going to be because you're getting more of a fair representation because you see so much kind of variance between them. So like one quadrat had 2, whereas one had 24. So massive difference. And if the average is 12.9 daisies per 0.25 meters squared, you can then work out how many there are in meters squared. what you basically do is you multiply it by 4, because if there's that many in 0.25 to get into 1 meter squared, you're going to times it by 4. So times that by 4, and that'll get you your 1 per meter squared, which is 51.6. And then if you want to work out the whole field, you just times it by 1,000. So yeah, it's just basic maths. Again, I won't be too worried about that, but just be aware of the method, because again, I've seen long answer questions ask you about the method of it. So make sure you're talking about dividing the area up into small segments, talking about the fact that you use a random number generator to select which area is going to put your quadrat in, and then placing the quadrats down. You've got to mention random sampling. You've got to do that with a quadrat. So make sure you mention that randomly, allocating the numbers, dividing the field up, using a random number generator to select which areas you're going to quadrat, putting the quadrats down, chucking them in those areas, counting the number of flowers there, and then working out an average, and then working out how many you'd expect in the whole field.